The biggest thing that excites me is this is one of those subjects where you can never learn everything about it. There's
Mhm.
always more to learn. There's always more stories to find. I still to this day find new books that I hadn't seen before or new things come out. I talk to people all the time who've had their own experiences, again, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but it's one of those subjects that I feel like the more you learn about it, the more you realize how little you know about
Mhm.
it. So yeah, it's just endlessly intriguing. Like there's always something else to learn when it comes to this, and I love that.
Welcome to Big Crystal Energy, Season 3, the Veil Season. I'm Ashley, and I live at the threshold between medicine and magic, between the visible world and what waits just beyond it, between the person I present and the witch I am. I've learned something. The in between isn't a problem to solve, it's a place of power. This season, we're exploring the veil, where Victorian women spoke for the dead, where fairies guard the crossroads, where glamour becomes armor, where you stop apologizing for being both things at once. The crystals have always known the way through. Let me show you. Welcome back to Big Crystal Energy. I am your host, Ashley, and today we are doing something I have genuinely been looking forward to since I started planning the season. Probably something I've been genuinely looking forward to. Oh my gosh, I forgot to blow out my incense. Since I was just a young girl, we'll be honest about that. So, in this season of Big Crystal Energy, we have been living in that liminal space. We've been talking about the veil, exploring the threshold between places, the in between moments, the spaces where the boundary between worlds and what lies beyond it become like this permeable, where what is ordinarily hidden becomes, if you're paying attention, perceptible. And there is perhaps no subject that belongs more naturally in that conversation than fairies, because the fairy world is not somewhere else. It is not a distant realm you travel to. It exists at the threshold. It exists in the thin places, at the edge of the forest, at the crossing of two roads, at the shore where land meets water, at dusk when the day has not yet surrendered to night. The Fae are, in the deepest sense, liminal beings. They live in the space between, and the veil separates our world from theirs is the same veil we have been pulling back all season. April on Big Crystal Energy is entirely devoted to fairies. And I mean that in the fullest, most serious, most historically grounded sense of the word, not the sanitized, sparkly Tinkerbell version, the real ones, the ancient ones, the ones that European folklore treated with a combination of reverence, protective ritual, and genuine fear, because they deserve all three. To kick off this series, I have brought in one of the most prolific and rigorous scholars working in this space today. My guest is Morgan Daimler, an author, blogger, and teacher with an extensive body of work on Irish mythology, fairy faith, and the intersection of folklore and modern pagan practice. Morgan was recently recognized in Green Egg magazine as one of the 10 pagan voices shaping our future. That's huge. And honestly, if you know their work, you understand why. Morgan has written more books on the subject than most people have ever read, including Fairy Witchcraft, the Pagan Portals series, such as Faery, Lore of the Irish Fairies, and the one we're going to spend time on today, Fairy Craft, a practical guide to working with the Fae within a witchcraft context. Morgan approaches this subject with something rare: genuine folkloric scholarship and lived practice. That combination is exactly why I wanted them on this show, and exactly why this conversation is going to be different from anything you've heard on fairies before. This episode is part of our April Fairy series, so if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because you do not want to miss what's coming this month. All right, let's go chat with Morgan. Morgan, welcome to Big Crystal Energy. I am so glad you're here. And I do want to congratulate you because you were recently named one of the 10 pagan voices shaping our future in Green Egg Magazine, which I feel is very well deserved. I thought that was pretty cool.
I was kind of shocked.
I'm
I'm
not.
su- I'm such a niche author.
I
um,
love it.
yeah, I think it was very cool to see someone on the list who isn't sort of the mainstream,
Yes.
I guess, stuff you would expect. Everyone else on the list was also awesome and amazing, and I'm very, very flattered to be in such esteemed company.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it was so cool. When I saw that, I was, yes, that's awesome. I was so happy for you. That was cool. And a lot of other amazing people right alongside you. So I
Yes.
just wanted to acknowledge that before we, jumped in. But I just wanted to share something with you and my listeners before we start this, because I want to kind of explain why this the fairies mean so much to me, because they have really always been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. I mean, as a child, they were really part of my world. I didn't question it. I just felt like they were always there.
Mhm.
I remember a very, very specific incident of in my front yard, there was a tree and there was, I mean, the only thing I can think of it looking back is it must have been a little fairy like coming out of the tree, its little head. And I've always been able to see that in my mind, like all my life. I remember it. And of course, as we get older, the relationship kind of gets more complicated because you start learning about things, you grow up. I went to college and I still felt like really open to the fairy realm when I was in college. I was like deep in it during that time. But this was like the late 90s, early 2000s. So there wasn't as much information as there is now. You even getting online, you couldn't really find things. I was in college, and the first thing that someone came up to me and they could tell that I must have been a fairy lover because they gave me this book, Fairy Folk. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
Yep,
It's like,
yep, I've got that one.
yep, yeah. This one came out in like 94. Someone that was living in my college dorm gave me that. So that was like my go-to for years. And then I really kind of got out of it. But now that I've been getting back into it, man, there's like like you are a prolific author. You've written so much on the subject. I'm just like, wow, so impressed. And then I just feel like the folklore and the knowledge that is provided now is so fascinating. So that's, I
It's
mean, yeah.
it's funny talking to people who are just getting into witchcraft and paganism, say, or just getting into fairies today, as opposed to, like you were just saying, in the 90s, very limited resources.
Mhm.
Just there's so much that has come out, really, even just in the last 20 years. And on top of that, as you know, in the 90s, the internet was like in its infancy. There was
Mhm.
not much out there.
Mhm.
And a lot of it was maybe a little more questionable than it is today. I'm sure there's still questionable stuff out there today, but you have
For
so
sure.
many good resources out there now. So you're really living in some interesting times.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So before we get into it, can you just tell my listeners who you are and how you came to this work and just like what your relationship with the Fae look like?
Sure. So, you think where to start with this? I have always seen and experienced the good folk, fairies. I kind of grew up in when at the time did not feel like a fortunate situation, but I really understand, like, with the perspective of adulthood. I was raised what I call secular agnostic, which
Mm,
means basically no religious at all. Not like my parents weren't religious people, but my dad was Catholic, my mom was Protestant, and they got married in the 70s. And at the time, the only way for their families to agree was for them to promise that any children would not be raised in either religion, which I think is extremely strange. But that was that was the deal they made.
okay.
So what it meant for me was growing up, we celebrated like Santa coming and giving presents with his magical reindeer, and a magical bunny brought us chocolate. Like those were our holidays. There was no like religious overtone to anything. So the closest thing I had was sort of being part of the Irish American diaspora and growing up with the belief in fairies, that fairies are real, that fairies are around us, things like that. So when I was really little and I would tell my parents, like, oh, I saw a fairy, or, I'm want to leave something out on the windowsill as an offering to the fairies, they really didn't discourage that at all. They didn't participate in it or agree with it necessarily, but they never tried to convince me that they weren't real, or that I was being silly, or, any of the things that a lot of children unfortunately get told about these
Sure.
things.
Hmm.
So for me, they were just always kind of part of my reality. And then when I got into my teens, I kind of discovered written folklore. And I was like,
Hmm.
this is so cool, because there's these books out there, these people who've had experiences like I have, particularly in Irish culture. And it really helped sort of give me a framework for the stuff that I was experiencing on my own, and helped me to really understand it better. And then, was it 7 years ago now, I started being really active in academia as a folklorist. It's not my degree. I actually have a psych degree, but it's close enough. And I found that that really provided a good balance
Hmm.
to the experiences and to talking to people who also believed and experienced these things. And then you have sort of the academia side of it. And for me, I think it helps me not get too far in either direction, if that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Yes.
I do the academia, but I don't get too skeptical, because I actually do believe in these things. But actually believing in these things, the academia helps me not get too caught up in my own perspective, I guess we'll say. So that's kind
Yes.
of what's landed me here, the
That's
short
so
version.
interesting. I mean, would you be open to maybe sharing a personal experience that you've had?
Sure. I like to tell people I have lived a very weird life.
I love
So
that. I love weird.
I've had a lot of different experiences kind of over the years. I usually try to share stories that are more group experiences, like things that happened where there were other people there to kind of verify it, I guess.
Hmm.
But I'll tell you this, since you had kind of shared a story from your childhood. My first memory of interacting with someone who I believe is a fairy, I was 5, and we had just moved into a new house. And the place where my room was, there was a street light outside, and there was a big old tree. So when I would go to bed at night, my room would be dark, and I'd have all these like really creepy shadows kind of on the wall from the tree. But when you're 5, it that's not how you look at things.
Right.
You're not thinking, okay, this is the shadow of the tree branches kind of moving on my wall. It just scares you. So I was kind of in bed at night crying, and, trying not to disturb anyone else in the house, but like just very scared. And I distinctly remember this redheaded woman appeared kind of next to my bed, and was just comforting me, telling me it was okay, that, I didn't need to be afraid of the shadows. There was nothing scary in the room, like that sort of a thing. And at the time, again, because I was so young, I really didn't even question it. You know, it was just like, okay, there is this
Hmm.
strange woman here, but she's being very comforting. And then she would eventually, disappear. I would fall asleep. And this happened several times when I was about this age, when I was really scared or upset about something. And that was kind of where this all started for me, at least as far as I can remember. If there was anything earlier than that, I don't clearly remember it, but I do remember that. So,
Yeah. I mean, I think those memories are just so, you're so open at that time, and those memories are just so formative.
yeah,
I mean, I
that's the
think,
great. Oh, sorry.
go ahead. Yeah.
I was just saying the great thing with children when it comes to fairies is because they are not skeptical. They don't have a mindset of trying to explain things away. They just sort of take experiences as they are. And I think that's why we see it more common for children to talk about, seeing fairies or having experiences with them as opposed to adults. I actually think that adults do have just as many experiences, but adults are so much better at being like, well, I was imagining it, or,
Mhm.
well, there's some explanation for it. It couldn't be what it seems like it was. Things like that. So, yeah, I I,
Do you
I think
think,
we need to listen to kids more.
yeah, I mean, do you think that some children are more perceptive, or do you think that as children that we're all kind of the same?
I think both, to be honest. I think all children are more open to perceiving these sorts of things, this sort of whatever we'd call it, supernatural phenomena. Again, because there is no filter that says, well, there has to be a so-called rational explanation for this. But I do think that some children are extra sensitive
Mhm.
to these sorts of things. And also, for whatever reason, some children seem to be more attuned in particular to fairies, or fairies are more drawn to them for whatever reason. So, yeah, I think it's a little bit of both.
Do you feel like you have, how do I want to say it? Have you always felt like a connection to the fairy realm?
I think so. I was an interesting child, as that other story might have demonstrated. I used to go out on the playground, and instead of the other kids are all playing at recess, and I would like go sit in a field and I would make little fairy houses out of twigs and grass and whatever I could find. When I was playing with my friends, I would convince them, like if I was at a friend's house or if they were over at my house, we'd go out in the yard and I would build very elaborate fairy houses like
Mhm.
this, benches and stones. I'd have little tables and beds. Like it was a lot. And I was doing that when I was very young,
Sounds so fun.
you know. Yeah, and it turns out now I found out when I was older that building fairy houses is actually a thing. Like there's books about it and
Yeah.
people do it. Yeah, you see these like fairy trails out there, but when I was doing it as a child, it was just like instinctual. It was just something that I
Mhm.
did. So, yeah. I've always
Yeah,
been
because
weird.
I mean, me too. Oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah.
See,
I
we
mean,
get along
I
great.
I know. I just feel like I was at a retreat over the weekend, and I was with this woman, and she was doing a reading for me, and I was like, I don't know how to explain this to you, but because we were talking about like our guides and like our spirit guides and things like this, and I was like, I don't know why, but I feel, and I was like, I feel like I'm in safe company to say this, but I have always felt like there is some connection of myself to the fairy realm, and I don't know how to explain that other than I just know it in my, like, I just know it in my soul, and I have always felt this way. But
I
it feels weird to say that to someone.
Oh, you've come to the right person. It's not weird at all to me.
Yeah. I mean, it
Um,
just feels like nobody else in my world is, they're like, "What are you talking about? That what? You're a
yeah,
4-year-old woman, like, why are you saying that?"
unfortunately, particularly here in the United States, not exclusively in the US, but particularly here in the US, fairies have kind of really been relegated to like children. So
Mhm.
if you say you believe in ghosts in the US, a lot of people might be skeptical, but you'll get a lot of people who are like, oh, maybe, I don't know. If you say you had a ghost experience, people will listen to it a lot of times. They might not totally believe it, but they don't totally not believe it either. But as soon as you mention fairies, it's immediately like, oh, that's silly. That's for children. That's make believe.
Mhm.
It does make it harder. That's actually one of the reasons why I started talking about my personal experiences years and years ago, because I wanted to kind of get it out there that you can be a very, adulty adult, but
Yeah.
still believe in fairies and have fairy experiences and things like that. And I
Mhm.
think that the only way we're going to get to be more acceptable is for more people to talk about it.
I mean, I think that's kind of why I even started my podcast, because I've always had connections to lots of different things, but I don't have anyone in my world that in my day-to-day life that is like on my same plane. And so I'm like, okay, well, I want to start sharing these things.
Mhm.
And I know that I can't be the only one out there. And I don't think I have a screw loose. Like I really don't. I work in the medical field. I do orthopedic surgery by day. Like I am with it. But I also know that there's that and then there's something else.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me, and again, not to keep picking too much on the United States here, but it's interesting to me that like we are in a country where, if you believe in fairies, you are kind of seen as being a little out there or a little wacky. But if you believe in angels, that's
Okay.
perfectly
Great.
acceptable. you
Yeah.
know, if you, because I see it all the time where people will talk about angels or guardian angels or,
Hmm.
believing that angels even intervened in things, miracles, stuff like that. And it's not questioned because that's kind of the dominant narrative in the country. But if you say fairies instead of angels, suddenly that's, very strange and different. And realistically, like on an energy level, I don't think there's a huge difference when we're talking about some of these types of spirits. They're not the same thing, but they're the same kind of thing in general, if that
Sure.
makes sense.
It does make sense. Now, most people, when they hear the word fairies, they're picturing like something like small and flittery and sparkly and like a Tinkerbell type of situation. But with the material that you work with and, a lot of the research that I've done, you know, it's kind of, it's actually a lot different than that.
More
I mean,
complicated,
if you,
I'm sure.
it's like extent, like very, very much more complicated than that. Like the Tinkerbell version is something that is now just like Disney Hollywood, but that's not the true story. That's not the whole story.
I usually tell people when the subject of fairies comes up, sort of our starting point, is that when you think of the word fairy, even though people will always have like that immediate knee jerk impression, like you said, sort of that Disney, twee little winged child thing. The word fairy is really more of an umbrella term, and that's how it's been
Yeah.
used for centuries. And it kind of covers a range of beings that are in the human world, but sort of from another place, from the world of fairy, the other world, that they have what we would call magical abilities. They can influence things that humans can't affect in the same way. They can be invisible or not, but they can appear very human-like in a lot of the stories. Some of them are shapeshifters, so they can look like a horse or a cat or a dog or whatever they want to look like. And you do certainly have the little tiny winged fairies out there. They would be sort of within that wider group. Kind of the older term for that type would probably be more like a sylph, which is a
Hmm.
specific thing. But yeah, when you read accounts from like Ireland or Scotland and they use the word fairy, they're talking about something that doesn't have wings, doesn't have pointed ears, looks fairly human, but is not. So yeah, it's a complicated subject.
Do you think that like the cute fairy is just something that became, it's like kind of more of like a cultural thing, right? Like that just kind of developed over time, right? It's not, I mean, like,
I
how do you
think
think it went
so.
from, I mean, how did it go from kind of like in the folklore, looking back, I mean, it's transmuted so much, I think,
Mm,
into how we kind of people think of it today. I mean, it's gone
for
under,
sure.
it's, yeah.
So basically, I'm gonna see if I can be as concise as possible with this.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you look across the like breadth of folklore about fairies in Western Europe, most of the stories are about very human-like beings who are not human, and they can be helpful, they can be dangerous, kind of like humans in that way too. And then what we kind of start to see specifically in England about 300 years ago is this idea of fairies being very tiny. And it had to do with some other cultural things that were happening in England at the time. They were got very fascinated with like the miniature and the idea of things being
Mm.
miniaturized. And then we sort of hit the Victorian era.
Mhm.
And the Victorians were the ones who really kind of leaned into the idea that fairies were tiny, that they were very childlike, very innocent. And then they started to be depicted even as more childlike in appearance. And we kind of get the wings coming in, sort of at art like in the mid 1800s. And it was just initially a good way to like visually cue, okay, this is supposed to be a fairy in this painting because they have
Mhm.
wings. And they got butterfly wings because angels had bird wings and demons had bat wings. That was kind of the only option that was
Mhm.
left. That's what the fairies got. But then when we start to see like things like the flower fairies, Cicely Mary Barker's work,
Mhm.
which are very childlike and winged and connected to plants.
Mhm.
And then we do see things like Peter Pan coming in and all sort of reinforcing that particular
Yeah.
view of what fairies were. And what's fascinating to me, there's this thing that Dr. Simon Young did. It's called the Fairy Census. And he published the first one, and I think they're collecting stories for the second one. People basically respond to a survey of if they've had personal experiences. And you can kind of trace the way that in all the personal encounters we see up through about the 1980s, never have wings, usually not super tiny. And then it's like
Mm.
something kind of changes in the late 20th century, and suddenly you're seeing people saying, oh, I saw a small little winged fairy, or oh, I had this experience with like a small winged fairy. And probably that's the influence of like the pop culture stuff that was going on. And it
Mhm.
kind of raises this question about when we're seeing fairies, are we actually seeing them? Or are we seeing what we expect to see? They're kind of giving us what we expect.
I
Because
see.
fairies are supposed to have
But
this magic called glamour where they can influence like how we perceive them.
yeah, yeah.
I do not know the answer
So
to that, by the way.
what?
I don't know the
You
answer
do.
to that, by the
Oh,
way,
okay.
but it's
Yeah.
like an open question.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting concept. So they're kind of changing the way they're being perceived so that we're perceiving them in the way that we are expecting to perceive them. That's a really interesting. I like that.
Yeah.
I like to sit with that for a minute. That's really fascinating. I'm like, okay, now I'm thinking back on my other experiences that I've had and I'm like, okay, that could make sense. I also want to speak to kind of the other world, or I mean, do you call it the other world or do you call it fairy, or there's other language here that I don't know how to pronounce? Tier,
That's
okay.
fair. Probably
Tier, how do
Irish.
you, yeah, it's in Irish. I'm not even,
Aunt Ella is one. Um,
okay.
that means the other world or the other life. And then there's specific names that also get used, like Chernanog,
Yes, that's
Maghmel.
what I was, yes,
Yep, yep. There's a range of terms out there. The Welsh is Anahwyn.
yes.
So they're all names for basically the same concept, the same idea that there's this reality that's kind of adjacent to the human world, adjacent to human reality, the reality we're all in right now. Um,
Mhm.
and it's close to us, but not here.
Mhm.
I usually will use the analogy of like a piece of paper has two sides. So we're on one side, and the other world, twin and Ella, whatever you want to call it, is on the other side of that piece of paper.
Mhm.
And the good folk, the fairies, have the ability to kind of move back and forth. Humans generally don't. And we
Right.
can. Usually we have to go with a fairy, or sometimes it happens by accident in certain
Mhm.
circumstances. Yeah, and it's called all sorts of things. Fairy, fairyland, elfland.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking like, so when the, I mean, I guess when the fairies are visible to us, in whatever sense that is for us, like, have they then kind of crossed through that threshold and then they kind of stepped into our realm?
Yeah, the idea would be that they can choose to come through and interact with our world. And humans just don't generally have that same kind of ability the way the fairies do to move back and forth. They also, because like I mentioned with that glamour, they can influence how humans perceive them. So they can choose to be invisible. They can be around us, and there's a lot of different stories in folklore about this, but we might not necessarily see them, even though they're
Yeah.
kind of right there. There's a really famous, it's not even a story, it's like a story trope. The borrowed midwife is what it's called. It's this idea that fairies don't reproduce very often or very easily, so they don't have their own midwives. So when you have a fairy baby being born, they have to basically borrow a midwife from the local human.
Mm.
And she gets brought in, she helps deliver the baby, and then she's given this like ointment or salve, and she's told to put it on the baby's eyes, but to be very careful not to touch her own. And of course, then in the story, she always accidentally rubs one of her eyes and can immediately see through this fairy illusion. She can
Mm.
kind of see the reality that's going on around her. And what usually then happens is she's at like a market fair later and sees the fairy father of the baby and kind of greets him. And he's shocked that she can see him because she's not supposed to be able to. So it's that kind of concept that they can be around us, but we're not aware of them without like a magical ointment, or if they choose to
Mm.
be seen.
I mean, would you say that there are places that if that would be more that people are more likely to have an encounter, or is that more of like your own perception and what you're open to? You could have encounters in your own home, or you have a better chance like going to a forest or near a body of water or something like that.
I think your odds are definitely higher if you're somewhere that has a lot of stories about people having encounters. If you
Mhm.
go to some place that's sort of well known for having these kinds of beings around, their chances are going to be better. But, you really can kind of see them anywhere. And sometimes you'll see them in places you really wouldn't expect. So, yes, wild places are a big option. Sacred sites like Neolithic stone circles, Iron Age mounds, things like that. If you're in like Ireland or Scotland or Wales, definitely increase your odds. But I have had experiences in the city, I've had experiences in the suburbs, so sometimes it's just, I think, fortunate timing. You
Mhm.
happen to be in the right place at the right time to kind of have the experience. So no matter where you are, it is a possibility.
I was listening to an interview that you had done, and one of the things that I thought was really fascinating is you had talked about how most of the time people imagine fairies kind of in these like old style clothes, but kind of like how we're evolving, they are evolving too. So you wouldn't necessarily come in contact with them looking like they're out of the olden times or whatever. They would probably potentially look more modern.
Yeah, and this is part of why I think people do still have a lot of these experiences. They just don't understand what they're experiencing because we have such a like set idea of what a fairy would
Mhm.
look like or what a fairy experience would be like. And if you look at the older stories, and I'll get into the modern kind of segueing there, but if you look at the older stories, the idea was always that when you see one of the fairies, when you see one of them out and about, they usually are dressed pretty much like the local human community, but maybe like a generation out of date.
Mhm.
Their clothes are slightly old fashioned, but not archaic. Like the way when you talk to people now, they're like they expect to see someone in like Ren Fair garb, like
Right.
medieval garb, and you might, if you're at a Ren Fair and run into a fairy, that might be what they're wearing. But I've talked to people who have had modern experiences who describe fairies wearing like jeans and a t-shirt or,
Mhm.
things like that. Sometimes still a little out of place. I think that's super hard today though, because there's such a wide range of fashion, that
Yes.
people will wear. I used to say, you could tell if you run into someone who's dressed like, a hippie from the 1960s or 70s, but that fashion has kind of like cycled back
Yeah.
around. So
Hmm.
not as helpful anymore. Yeah, you could see a fairy wearing almost anything at this point.
But their sense of time is not the same as ours.
Right. There's this idea that the other world is, like I said, it's kind of adjacent to our world, but it's not 100% aligned with our world. So the human world has time that flows in a certain way. Other worlds, not so much. So there's all sorts of stories about someone who goes and spends a night, with the fairies, and sometimes they come back and it's no time has passed that shouldn't have passed and it's fine. Other times, though, they come back and it's a year later, or in extreme cases, like 100 years later. And interestingly, we also have stories where it's the opposite. The person goes into the world of fairy and lives for a year and then comes back, and only 5 minutes have gone by in the human world. So there's definitely some kind of weird temporal stuff that happens. And it is possible that that is part of why they can dress like they're a little out of date. They don't tend to have technology quite the way humans do. And this is sort of now an open question for people who believe in the good folk and interact with them today. Like, where would their technology be at? You know, in a lot of the stories, again, like the clothing, they're open to technology stuff. They just tend to be a little behind where humans are at that point.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
That makes sense. And I think like we learn about fairies, but it's like you said, that's kind of like a umbrella term for so many different things. Like there's like there's so many different types, right? Within that kind of underlying under that umbrella. I mean, you have like the changelings and the brownies and the all the different ones. I mean, I guess I don't know what most people have ever. I mean, what would you say like the most common types of fairies most people would have heard of?
For things people would have probably heard of, leprechauns are really
Yeah.
popular. I've run into a lot of people that know what kelpies are, although that might be
Hmm.
a little more niche. Kelpies are shapeshifters. They look like horses, but they can also appear human. Elves are a pretty big one. That also gets messy because there's different kinds of elves. If we're talking like the Icelandic elves or the Scottish elves, they're kind of like the Tolkien elves. They look fairly human, super beautiful. If we're talking like the shoemaking elves in England, they're going to be fairly small, maybe not as attractive as the North
What
version.
about like gnomes? Would gnomes be considered a type of like
Yep, gnomes
fairy?
gnomes get put into the category of fairy quite a bit. I will say, to be fair, before everyone watching this starts blasting into the comments, there's a lot of debate about what exactly should fit into this category.
Sure.
And some people, I tend to take a broad view of it, like anything historically that would have been understood as a fairy or labeled a
Hmm.
fairy. That's good enough for me. Other people really argue for not even using it as an umbrella term, just kind of throwing it out. So it's a messy subject.
I'm sure
For
in your
people,
world there's a lot of nuance.
there is. With fairies, you kind of have to accept that, everything is about nuance and also sometimes contradictory. Like you can have things that contradict themselves, but they're still both equally valid within the realm of belief. For people who are interested, there's a really good book that just came out called Fairy Lore. I did not write it,
Oh,
but
I was like, okay,
it.
you can promote your book. That's right.
Yeah. Well, yeah. To be fair, I did not write it, but it's this really nice kind of illustrated guide to fairies around the world, different types of fairies from Western Europe, and then fairy-like beings from other cultures, and it covers a lot of ground. So
Okay.
More like if we could spend the entire rest of this discussion just talking about types of fairies. So
Oh yeah, I know. I know, and I would love to, but I mean, for time's sake, do you have one like a specific type of fairy that you are particularly interested in or drawn to?
I tend to primarily focus on, and my main interest is the Irish. They're called Aishí, the people of the fairy hills,
Mhm.
which in Scotland they would be called elves. In Ireland and English they're called fairies. So it's a little hard to like not use the Irish term to discuss them because then it sounds like
Mhm.
we're just again talking about the whole umbrella term. But yes, the Aishí would be my main kind of interest personally.
And why do you find that? Is it because of your heritage or you just find them fascinating or why is that?
All of the above. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, certainly they were sort of the first ones I was introduced to. My grandfather was from Cork, so I kind of had a lot of those ideas and beliefs sort of at a young age. And I also like getting into the folklore and other people's stories and encounters. I just find them really fascinating. They are sort of a blend of different things happening with them. It's down in the old Irish gods were said to have gone into the she. She is just an Irish word. It means like otherworldly mound or hill,
Mhm.
every mound or hill. So you have like the Irish gods are in there, and you have these other beings who were not gods originally, but are in there. They have all sorts of interesting things going on. So yeah, I find them to be very intriguing.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. Now, do you believe in the concept of good fairies and bad fairies?
That's such a great question. Yes and no. So I do think that dividing them into sort of good and bad gets complicated. Then how are we defining good and bad? But I do
Mhm.
think we can sort of loosely say there are certain types of fairies that are more inclined to help people, to help humans, to at least give humans a warning before anything bad might happen. And then you have the fairies who just really don't have any concern about humans at all and are perfectly willing to cause them problems or do them violence or what have you, or have them on the menu in some of the folklore. So I do think we can kind of look at it like the ones that are more inclined to be friendly and the ones that are more dangerous is sort of how I would term it.
Yeah, I mean, I asked you because like one of my favorite books when I was younger was the famous Good Fairies, Bad Fairies.
Yep,
You
Brian
know, the
Froud.
illustrations and that. Yeah, it's just so classic and
Yeah.
you know, it was just like iconic, you know, of the visuals of the good fairies and bad fairies. But do you think that I mean, based on his drawings, do you think I mean, do you think that those are close to what those types of fairies may look like, or do you think those are just purely kind of illustration just from his imagination?
I am a huge Brian Froud fan. Just full disclosure. He's
Same.
not. He's amazing. I have his Oracle decks that he did.
Me too. I
Fairly,
have my original, like the old one from way back.
yep,
Obsessed.
fairies. And yeah, his
Oh my
artwork is
God,
so amazing.
obsessed.
I actually have some signed prints by him.
Oh,
Um,
what a
yeah,
dream.
I totally fangirl about Brian Froud. I
Oh,
do
me
believe
too.
that he is genuinely tapped into something. He has a book that came out before I was born, but it's still in print and it's amazing. It's just called Fairies. It's
Mhm.
Brian Froud and Alan Lee. I think Alan Lee
Oh, I
did all
have
the
that too. Yeah.
right.
Oh yeah, got
Yeah.
that. Mhm.
And I love that one in particular. I do like the Good Fairies, Bad Fairies as well. But I like the Fairies book because he covers the whole range. He's
Mhm.
got the sort of very regal, noble, human looking good folk fairies. He has the Kelpie, he has the red cap, which is one of the really dangerous ones. He has little winged ones. He kind of just covers everything, and his artwork is amazing. And I do think that for people who are looking to understand, like, what do these beings look like, Froud is a great option.
Okay,
You
well, that
know?
makes me happy
Yes.
to that makes me happy to know that. that you
Yep.
think that.
If you want, speaking of Froud, if you want something to watch that gives you a real feel for kind of how fairies are, I highly recommend Labyrinth,
Yes.
the movie with David Bowie. Yeah,
Amazing.
it came out in the 1980s, but it kind of,
Hmm.
again, it covers that whole range. And also just the way, particularly Jareth, the Goblin King, acts is
Hmm.
very, very fairy.
Hmm.
You know, he makes deals, he really messes with her life, he steals her baby brother, which is the thing
Yeah.
fairies do, you know, to turn him into a goblin. And then you have the goblins who are kind of goofy, but also sort of dangerous.
Hmm.
And you have all these other beings that show up in the movie. Obviously, it is a movie, so it's not like
Right.
a documentary for me. But watch that if you want to
Yes.
understand the concept. Yeah.
You know, I
Really
think,
quick,
go ahead.
that movie actually has one of my all-time favorite quotes, which is when Hoggle, the little goblin, sprays the little winged fairy, and the
Hmm.
human protagonist Sarah goes to pick it up and it bites her. And
Hmm.
she's like all upset, and then Hoggle's just like, "What did you expect a fairy to do?"
I love that.
And I will stop talking about Brian Frad now, I promise.
No, I don't want you to. I was going to say, have you ever been anywhere where he was? Have you ever met him in person?
I wish. I would love to meet him in person.
I
Or
bet
his
you would.
wife, she also does
Yeah.
she does practical fairy art. Like she creates
Hmm.
I call them dolls because that's not fair, but like little
Yeah.
sculptures of
Yeah, I know
fairies
what you
and
mean.
photographs them.
Hmm.
Yeah, Wendy Froud, she's cool. And their son, who is actually the baby in the movie Labyrinth, he now also is doing work, from what I understand, the same way. So it's a family business. But yeah, I love Brian Froud.
Okay, I'm so glad that
I
we
would
were
love
able
to
to
meet
connect
him.
over that. I know, because I was like, I hope that she isn't weirded out if I bring him up because this isn't a conversation 100% about him, but still I feel like he's so iconic and his art is just, I mean, to me that was something that really made me understand, it made me understand the idea of fairy so much, because especially through his deck, because you could have something that was so human like, but then also something that was just like a light,
Very.
or I remember one time I went to like a grocery store, and I remember being at the checkout, and the person that was checking me out, I was just like, something about them, I was like, I don't think this checkout person is actually of this world. I think that checkout person is actually a fairy.
Yeah.
And
And it's
I don't know why
possible.
I thought that. It is possible. And it was just like, it was something that I had read in it was something that I had read in one of his books or his deck or something that made me feel like I'm connecting with this individual on a different level here. And I don't know why, but I just was like, I don't know. It was weird.
Yeah, and that sounds very plausible. One of the main ways that people talk about in stories identifying someone as a fairy is that the person just doesn't feel human. Like it feels like
Yes.
there's something more going on. There's like an aura to them. So yeah, I think when you look at a lot of the modern encounters people talk about, it's things like someone shows up kind of inexplicably and then there's just something about them that is kind of strange or unusual, and then they kind of disappear inexplicably. But I firmly believe you can kind of encounter them anywhere, and
Yes.
sometimes they look human.
Yeah. I mean, it's just such an interesting concept to think about. I mean, I think that, a lot of times it's just those of us that are more open to it. I mean, we're the potential of seeing these things is probably just much higher
I
because
agree.
you're kind of tapped into a different, I don't know if it's like a vibration or what it is exactly, but
I think that some people who are more open to these sorts of energies, more aware of them, more connected to them, you are going to be more aware of stuff that's around you. And you're going to
Mhm.
see it, you're going to notice it when other people might not, because you're, like you said, you're on that wavelength, you know?
Mhm. Now, you did write a book, which I have here, which I've really been enjoying. And I wish I honestly would have found it a long time ago. But this book, Fairycraft, I've been loving this because I, since I love fairies, like I'm like, oh, now I can find more ways to work with them myself. But if someone was, I mean, how do you determine if you're someone that is a good candidate to work with fairies? I mean, do you feel like that is a safe space for anyone, or how would you kind of determine that for yourself? Because it's kind of a very niche aspect of
It's
witchcraft in
very
general.
niche. I think that anyone can try, and this is something that I always tell people, and I'm pretty sure I wrote it in the book as well. There's people that spend decades trying to connect and work with fairies, trying to have fairy experiences, and just never do. And then there's
Hmm.
people who would maybe really rather not have
Hmm.
experiences, but they constantly do. And it really just comes down to the fact that, fairies are their own beings. They're independent, they have their own agency, they can do what they want. And sometimes they like a person, and if that happens, they're going to be around you more. And other times, for whatever reason, maybe it's an energy thing, whatever, they just don't like someone, they don't want to be around them. So what I usually tell people, if you're drawn to this, if you're interested in it, is definitely try to build those connections, sort of put it out there. I always suggest to people, like, specifically say, like, goodly inclined spirits, the ones that are willing to be kind to you or to help you. Don't just throw the door open to kind of anything, because that I've seen that cause problems. You get a
Hmm.
response, but it's definitely not the response you wanted, and then you're
Hmm.
kind of dealing with it. So I do think anyone can make the attempt, and then I think it's up to the spirits in question whether they respond or they don't.
I mean, would we think of fairies in a like a spiritual sense? I mean, that's the
Potentially.
question. I mean, are these things that we're inviting into our world in a like a guide, or that spiritual aspect of it, or is it just or are we inviting them in because we want something around, or we want help with certain things?
Yep. The fun thing to me about any kind of spirituality intersecting with fairies, or in your life intersecting with fairies, is there are so many different ways you can go about it. And because there are so many types of fairies out there, there are so many different types of beings you can potentially connect to. So my main focus, as I mentioned, is the Irish Ishi, the fairy folk in Ireland. I have a friend, an online friend. I think I've met her in person a couple times as well, but she focuses more on the sorts of fairies that would be in like gardens and connects to plants.
Hmm.
And a lot of her work is focused on gardening in a very sustainable way, and wind chimes, like beautiful things kind of out where her plants are, to sort of connect with and draw in that specific type of energy, that specific type of fairy. And, I know people who are more on the Welsh end of things who connect with like those sorts of beings. So you have so many different options. If this isn't like a spiritual thing for you, you definitely don't have to be a witch to do any of this. You could just be like, I want to have a little garden. I'm gonna put a little fairy house in it outside, and
Hmm.
try to draw in or connect to those types of fairies. Or, you could decide, I'm going to be an artist, and I'm going to be like Brian Froud and try to depict all of these beings and try to connect to, what might be around you on that level. Like there's just infinite ways you can do this, which is part of why I think anyone can try. You can sort of tailor it to your own life and what works or doesn't work for you. Again, whether they respond or not is up to them, but you can definitely try it in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I love that aspect of it too. I mean, I think that that's kind of, I mean, for those of us that are trying to follow these different paths, I mean, it's nice to be able to interact with things in different ways. And, there's not always one right way. Or, I mean, do you find that there's like wrong ways to interact with them?
I mean, the biggest thing that I would say is the wrong way is to just throw that door wide open, like I mentioned earlier. And I have seen that cause people problems where they so much want some kind of experience, some kind of proof, I guess you would say, that something is going on, that they're sort of like anything that's around, you know, come in and interact with me. And then they end up with something that's on that more dangerous end of the scale, and it ends up causing a lot of problems. So I think that would be like the biggest wrong way.
Hmm.
Second to that is being rude and commanding. Like I have seen people do that too, where they just sort of demand, like, and
Mm.
now you're gonna, I'm invoking you, and you have to come do that, and you
Nobody
know,
wants to be told that.
no, I mean, yeah, I was just gonna say, even another human, like you can't just go up to
No,
them and be like, I demand your presence. It's not gonna go over well.
no,
And that's the same thing.
absolutely not.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I could probably talk to you about this forever, but just to be aware of time, I'm just curious, what are you first of all, what keeps you coming back to this? I mean, you've written so much on this topic. Like what keeps you feeling excited about it?
You know, the biggest thing that excites me is this is one of those subjects where you can never learn everything about it. There's
Mhm.
always more to learn. There's always more stories to find. You know, I still to this day find new books that I hadn't seen before or new things come out. I talk to people all the time who've had their own experiences, you know, again, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but it's one of those subjects that I feel like the more you learn about it, the more you realize how little you know about
Mhm.
it. So yeah, it's just endlessly intriguing. Like there's always something else to learn when it comes to this, and I love that.
Yeah, I was like going down this deep, deep rabbit hole for the last several days leading up to this, and I was just like, boy, I just there was so much stuff that I didn't know. I mean, because I haven't focused on this in a while, and I was just like, wow, there's like all kinds of documentaries, and there's all kinds of so many new books that are coming out. I mean, I remember when I was in college or, years ago, and I would go to Barnes and Noble and there was like nothing. There would be like one
Nothing.
little tiny book and it was not even that great. And
Yeah.
now it's like
Yeah,
you
that's
can find one.
yep. No, I agree. It's we live in such a great time for that, and I don't necessarily agree with everyone. You know, there are certainly perspectives where I have to kind of bite my tongue and be like, well, I have the exact opposite opinion of that. But I love that there's so many opinions out there. I love that there's
Mhm.
so many people now, comparatively, coming forward and talking about their views of this and their experiences with this. And I think that it makes for a subject where really, no matter where you're coming from, no matter what your perspective is, there is a place for you in there somewhere.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really cool. So what are you working on now? I mean, have you what's your latest and greatest?
Always working on something.
Yeah.
I I have a book on the fairy courts coming out the end of next month, and that is looking at the idea of the good fairies and bad fairies, basically, and sort of
Okay.
how that's evolved and how it went from the two fairy courts to now there's a whole bunch of different ones, and kind of the way everything is sort of influencing everything else. I'm super excited about that one. I was really shocked that no one has written about it before.
Yeah.
I realized when I started writing about it that like there's no one out there who's talking about
You're the
this.
one.
That's you know, I take that whole Maya Angelou quote way too much to heart that if there's a book out there you want to read that hasn't been written, you need to write it.
You do take that
And
to heart.
it's you know, it's like my philosophy in life. Yeah.
That's so cool. Do you have like, I don't know, I mean, are there fairy conferences or how do you find all your people? Are you finding them online? Like, where are the fairy people? Where are all of us?
Some online. There are some decent groups occasionally around on social media. A lot of them are going to be very specific. So I end up being in many of them.
Hmm.
This one might be more focused on like the Irish and Scottish approach to things. This group might be more focused on sort of the smaller twee kind of fairies. This one might be focused more on, something else. So you kind of have to cast a bit of a wide net, but it's definitely out there. And I go to conferences, I go to events, I talk to people because I'm on social media, sadly, as much as I am, sadly, people, social media, I'm not a fan of it, and yet I am on it everywhere. But I have people approaching me, because they know that I am vocal about being a believer in these things and also, have really studied it in depth. So people will kind of find me and share their stories and things like that. So, yeah,
You're just all out there. You're
sadly.
just all out there for people to find.
For
I
someone who's,
found you.
you did across social media, yes, you found me. Yeah, for people who are kind of looking for a sense of community, that I think sometimes takes a little bit of effort. You kind of have to be willing to maybe try a few different options to figure out where you fit in the best, what's going to align the most with you.
Yeah, that makes sense. So where are you? Where are you on the interwebs?
Let me see, Facebook, Instagram. I have a TikTok. I have a YouTube channel.
And they're
My
all just
YouTube
under your
channel.
name.
Yes, everything will be under Morgan Daimler. And I always add this when this comes up. I do not do online readings. I don't sell people things except for my books, which everyone can buy if they want to. But I'm not going to like private message someone and be like, hey, my ancestors told me that your energy is amazing. I need to reach out to you. I don't have time. I'm a
No.
single parent and I am a folklorist and I have got too much on my plate.
Come on, people. You're writing a book a week. So we are not
Away.
yes.
Away. But yeah, so I'm everywhere on social media, but I will never private message you trying to get you to give me money. I
Okay,
have a
fair.
Patreon if you want to give me money. I don't
Fair.
reach out to people for that.
I love that. Well, so before we end, is there anything like any last little bit of thing that you would like listeners to know just regarding the fairy realm in general?
Sure. There's a ton of diversity, and I encourage people to be more open to that, to keep an open mind about what is or isn't a fairy, where you might encounter them, stuff like that. To definitely keep in mind that they're not all friendly.
Hmm.
Just like humans, you do want to be cautious in what you kind of jump into and who you're trusting and things like that. And finally, because I always have to have 3 points, just how I roll. Finally, that, the key to, I think, anything with fairies is really to just be willing to have the experience. Be willing to be open to the possibility of the experience. Because, like I said, I think that a lot of people do have them, but they immediately kind of rationalize it away. They convince themselves that didn't really happen, or that must have just been like a strange human, or whatever. And you kind of have to remove that rational filter and just be childlike in your
Yes.
approach. Be
Yes.
open to it. Yeah.
And I think that that is beautiful because so many of us lose our childlike qualities. And I think, that childlike vision, and it's so important to maintain that to some degree as we get older. I
I
mean,
100% agree.
yeah,
We all need a little
just,
more childlike wonder in our lives.
we do. We need more childlike wonder. We need more whimsy. We need more fun.
Oh,
Yes.
whimsy for sure.
I
Much
love
more
some
whimsy.
whimsy.
Yeah.
Okay, Morgan. Well, this was so amazing chatting with you. I absolutely loved it. I am just so excited to check out more of your work. If I meet Brian Froud one day, I'll tell him hi. You'll
One
probably
of
have
us
a
gets
higher
to meet
chance.
him.
higher chance of meeting him than me. But
You never know.
okay. You're the pro
You never
here.
know.
But
No,
yes,
it
thank
was
you
great
so
talking to
much.
you. I really enjoyed
This
it.
has been super fun. Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for spending this time at the threshold with me. If you want to go deeper, follow me on Instagram at mystical.mama.ash, where I share daily crystal magic and behind the scenes of this liminal life. You can also find resources, previous episodes, and ways to work with me at bigcrystalenergy.com. We're also on YouTube at Big Crystal Energy Podcast. And if this episode resonated with you, please rate it and review it and share it with a friend that you think would connect with it. It would mean so much to me and helping build this beautiful community of other magical friends and crystal workers. Thank you so much. Until next time, bye.